Hello, everyone. It's John Forrester, and welcome to the webinar. It's about time, but it's more importantly, it's about how you apply your attention and focus at any given time. Preparing for the webinar, I found a quote from David that I think is fitting. It's time to put time management behind us. I love that idea because it distinguishes GTD from all the approaches that claim we can actually manage time. So with that as a start, I'd like to introduce the crew, and then I'll cover a couple of logistical details before we get into the meat of it. So our panelists today are David Allen, Frank Sopper, Meg Edwards, and Julie Ireland. So how about a quick hello from each of you, and tell us where you are in the world today. David, let's start with you.
Hey, I'm in Amsterdam. We're in a nice, finally spring showed up here. So it's warm and humid and a couple of thunderstorms this afternoon, and it's absolutely gorgeous. So I'm in Amsterdam, mid-afternoon my time.
All right, thanks. Meg, how about you?
Oh, hi, everybody. It's just so delighted to be here again and lovely to see all the GTD Connect members. I'm right outside of Portland, Maine. Like David, the warm weather has finally come. We go from brutal cold to just brutally hot with no transition. So I have my fan nicely in the background here, but really delighted to be here and really looking forward to sharing this topic with all of you.
Super. Thank you. And let's stay with the East Coast theme. Frank, good morning. And where in the world are you?
Hi, Frank Sopper in the little village of Dummerston, Vermont. We like to think we're smarter in Dummerston. And glad to see that the sun never sets on David Allen Company.
That's right. We're all over the world now. Okay, let's come to the West Coast. Julie.
Good morning. Hello, everyone. I am in Santa Monica, where we're officially in June gloom. So it's super pea soup foggy. It's a little strange. And I always forget. I've only been here for like 20 years, and yet every year I forget, oh, right, that's what happens. It gets really foggy. And as a very, very high active mover, I'm on a yoga ball, and I promise not to bounce too much.
All right. Thanks, Julie. And I'm about an hour and a half northwest of Julie in the little town of Ojai. So we've got two in California, one in Maine, one in Vermont, one in Amsterdam. We've got a good-sized crowd on the line. We have people from all over the world. I won't try to name all the countries, but let's just say we're represented all over the world. And a couple of logistical details. In Zoom, there's a chat window. When you click in there, you'll see a choice of chatting with panelists or everyone. We hope you'll choose the everyone option so we can all learn from the questions you share and any comments. So all you have to do is click that little drop down to choose to share with everyone in the chat window. And as we go along, I will capture your questions for the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So you just feel free to get stuff off your mind. Consider that chat window to be your capture device, and I'll record your questions and save them for the end. And I just posted a link in there in the chat window to a zip file that you can download that has 3 PDFs about today's topic. There's an article from David Allen, a time log that Frank is going to talk about, and another PDF that Frank prepared about sequential and associative processors. And last but not least, Frank has generously made the focus survey available to you at no cost. It's fine if you've not taken the survey yet. We'll follow up with you after the webinar to make sure you all get a link to take the survey. You can take it later if you choose to and apply what you learn in this session. So if you haven't taken it, that's fine. You still have plenty of value to get from this webinar. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to David for some discussion about the intersection of GTD and Frank's work and some history and bringing us up to the present. David.
Sure, John. Thanks. It took me 25 years to figure out what I'd figured out, and that it was bulletproof, and that it worked, and that it had no cultural biases or gender biases or age biases or professional level biases, that this was human stuff. And so I figured out, okay, well, I've done my work. I've sort of defined the game, wrote the book, and people started to get value out of seeing that at random moments out there, and then started to uncover how difficult it seemed for a lot of people to implement this, on a day-to-day, just a consistent basis. Though it was very common sense in a way, these common practices were not common for a lot of people. And so even with dealing with the best and brightest and busiest people in the world, which I've done in my consulting and coaching, some people took it. Some people had resistance to parts of the process or whatever. So I said, well, it took me that long to figure out what I'd figured out, and probably the rest of my life to figure out how to distribute this and try to get it to stick for people and get people to implement this. And that was not my area of expertise. So I figured, well, I'd reached a milestone once I'd sort of defined the model. But then, boy, how much effort, how many differences there were in terms of how people took to this model or not, and how they took to it and whatever. That was, again, not my area of expertise. And then Meg was right on from the, early on of these days of trying to coach people about all this stuff. But understanding about different ways that people had to understand what this was about, how it integrated with how their minds worked. And there were very different styles, though this process itself is universal. The way people understand the process, the way people integrate the process is quite different. And even over the last few years, learning myself that the core elements of GTD were outcome and action. What are you trying to produce, and what's the next step you need to take? Actually, take two different parts of your brain to do that. There's a visionary part of your brain that figures out what's the outcome. And there's a execution part of your brain that figures out, okay, how do I do that? And where do I go? Where do I put my body? What do I do next? And starting to begin to understand that, wait a minute, this is actually a cognitive muscle or a cognitive awareness or a cognitive skill or something that people needed to become aware of to be able to implement this stuff elegantly. So, sorry, I didn't want to take too long about that, but I just wanted to say, that's why, first of all, Meg, I'll be disclosing to you, ADD and dyslexic, that had your own challenges, but then you figured out your own strategies about how to deal with this, ran across GTD and said, oh my God, this is such a key strategy for this. And then running across a person who had coached you and worked with you very closely, Frank Soper, and then Frank's work to understand how we all process this information and how it frames itself, et cetera. Just fascinating stuff. So we began to incorporate that. Gee, you guys don't have to remind me how many years ago to start to build this into how do we get people to actually implement this and make it easier for them to then integrate this sort of series of best practices that makes it easier for them to be able to do that, easier to them recognize how they need to do that and what their strategies need to be able to implement this that well. And so that's why, Frank and Meg, we've now spun off you guys as GTD Focus as a standalone business because I said, look, this was the core DNA of how GTD got started, was with one-on-one working with people individually to see how they could implement these best practices. And then you guys have taken this to a whole next level of game to understand, wait a minute, here are the intricacies of how people's consciousness and how their brains are framed and how, whether you come in with a associative or distributive or linear kind of way to think about how your world is, here are ways you can then manage this more elegantly, more easily, more quickly. So that's kind of a very short version of a very long story, as Meg and Frank, you guys know. That's my initial frame, and then I'll hand it over to you, Meg, to say, okay, so we handed the ball to you to start to become, okay, you are our major coach out there, one-on-one, virtual, with real-time, hours and hours and hours, and thousands of hours you've spent now, Meg, one-on-one with working with this process. So I'll hand it to you to frame this next in your context.
Yeah, thank you, David. Yeah, what I think was really interesting is this has definitely been a work in progress, right? I mean, when I got trained as a coach, there seemed to be a way of, okay, well, once we do the 2 days of coaching and do a couple of follow-up calls, they should be kind of good to go. And when I had coached Frank about 19 years ago, right off the bat, given his background, he knew how to take the best practices and guiding principles of GTD, which is really not rules-based. And as you said, it's universal. He knew right off the bat how to customize it. When a lot of people were going electronic and thinking that was the best list manager, he knew that it would be best for him to stay paper-based. When all those categories were given to him, he said, you know what, these are going to work for me, these didn't work for me. And right off the bat, he never got stuck. And I've always held the vision that people could install and implement and integrate GTD with grace and ease. But even I was finding that I was struggling on some parts, and I didn't know why. I didn't know why I was struggling with my weekly review. I didn't know why I was struggling with clarifying and organizing. I didn't know why when I was looking at my next actions or projects list, why, even though they had verbs, they were next actions, there wasn't an emotional component to it, there wasn't a aptitude component to it. And why was I, feeling like I had to do parts of GTD through some brute force? And when I reconnected with Frank, he just gave me a bunch of strategies given my preferences. And it just took my GTD practice to a whole nother level. And what we wanted to do in part with this webinar is Frank's going to take us through one of the first things that shows up when we start to do GTD in light of our preferences. So, Frank, over to you now. And then after Frank talks, what Julie and I are going to do is we're going to kind of ground it in some examples that we see of how we integrate the getting things done methodology, which is in one way of looking at it as as simple as an external trusted system. And that Frank's work is also about creating an internal trusted system and how we match that. So after Frank talks, Julie and I will give some coaching examples of where we see people, by having this information, are able to take their GTD practice to a whole nother level.
Thanks, Meg. I came to GTD and is now how we as humans manage and transfer information. And I'm particularly interested in all the quirky ways that manifests itself among all of us. But at that time, I was disastrous at handling the stuff of my life. So those of you GTD Connect members will be able to find somewhere in the dark corner of GTD Connect and in conversation David did, where I confessed that a couple of months before Meg approached me, I got an evening call from security at the college where I worked telling me my office had been ransacked. And I had to burst out laughing because that's how I left my office. So I was in desperate need of being able to manage the external stuff of my life. And Meg did the 2 days of workflow coaching with me in my office, and it was transformative for me. And so I've been a daily GTD practitioner for coming up now on 2 decades, and absolutely could not function without it. I'm extremely grateful to David for bringing this out into the world. And one of the first things I recognized from GTD was that David had done something that I hadn't seen before, because I'd tried every other organizational process that was out there. And David's was the first one that I found that was cognitively complete. And cognitively complete in our work, in my work, we had, at the beginning of the 21st century, we've been able to identify that we had 2 distinct processes that helped us manage and transfer information. So what David was talking about at the beginning, we have our divergent system, which is our rapid integration system. And then we have our convergent system, which allows us to put tight focus, thinking, and what the behavioral economist Daniel Kahneman, who got the Nobel Prize for economics a number of years ago, identified as thinking fast, which is our divergent rapid integration system, and thinking slow, which is our convergent one thing at a time, unpack, how do I know this, how am I going to get this done process. And David had created a way of interacting with the stuff of your life. And it was beyond just a system, because when Meg approached me with it, I said, Meg, if I could make a system work, I wouldn't need a system. But Meg said, no, this is a way of thinking about your stuff. And that's exactly what it was. And David's approach activates both sides. So you've got a cognitively complete way of understanding this. So I'm not going to go too much into that, since you're all Connect members, you're aware of that. When David asks the question, what's got your attention? He's activating that rapid integration system, what we call in our work the associative process. So if you took the survey, that's what you were seeing as the associative process. That's that rapid integration system that's holding us in present awareness, so that we can be as alert as possible in a 360-degree way to the opportunities that are flying at us in real time and the threats that may be flying at us in real time. And then we can activate our experience almost instantaneously to react to those things that are showing up in real time. And then when David says, what's your next action? That activates what we call the sequential process, that convergent system, where you have to take your full weight of your attention and focus and put it on one thing to understand, what is it? How do I know this? How am I going to get this done? And so that cognitive completeness really allows you to engage that stuff in your life with both of those processes. And at the same time, I'm calling this a 21st century awareness. Nobel Prize laureate Daniel Kahneman uncovered, David Allen uncovered, Jane Austen called it Sense and Sensibility, and Aristotle has a very fresh-sounding description of it in his Politics, what we call the associative Aristotle calls Daikian, what we call the sequential Aristotle calls nomos. So it's an essential part of the human condition, and it's part of how we think. Now, one of the powerful things that we've been able to uncover is not only do all of us have convergent and divergent approach to the information coming at us, but something analogous to handedness, and that we have a reflexive preference, most of us, for one over the other. So almost 60% of us have a reflexive preference for the sequential. Something comes to our attention, I want to catch it, hold it still, pin it down, unpack it a bit before I get the next thing. Pin it down, hold it still, unpack it a bit before I get the third thing. Almost 40% of us have that divergent preference. So when something comes to our attention, we want to know, how does this fit in with everything else that's got my attention and focus, and what do I already know about it? And what's bringing us to the topic today is that in conversation I had with John, we have a very recent discovery. Neuroscientist David Eagleman has done the breakthrough work on this. And again, it's kind of fresh to the 21st century, but it feels so obvious now that Eagleman's unpacked this that it's hard to understand why we haven't recognized this sooner. But here it is. When we activate our associative process for that divergent thinking, we actually experience time differently than when we activate our sequential process to follow that thing through to a conclusion. And the way that operates in our work, and the reason we're doing all this today, is because it has a profound impact on what David said in the very beginning. Why do some people, or actually not some people, why does nearly everybody at some point or another struggle with the GTD process? Because it's cognitively complete, it works across cultures and across. Why do people get stuck? And one of the powerful ways we get stuck is not understanding the shift in time perception and the impact and the friction that causes by not being in touch with that shift in time perception can be very powerfully active on your GTD process. So here's how that difference in time perception meets our experience.
Can you stop for 1 second? Because, what you're talking about is the different ways that people started to integrate what our coaching was for them and how they took it easily or not. So I wanted to bring this back down as we could. All of this has to do with the framework that people have in their minds, how they're perceiving this, and then how they relate to the initial behaviors that we coach people into when they start to integrate this. How easy is this to dump their head, for them to slow down their brain processing, to figure out next actions, etc., and why these are fairly complex issues for the cognitive process of us to deal with that we think is so simple in a way once you kind of get it.
Yeah, so we've got the rapid integration process that's holding us in the present. We've got that slow process that's slowing us down. What happens is when we're in the present moment, we don't feel time passing. When we're in the sequential process, we get the tick-tick of our time passing. And so the associative process is when you're in the present moment, an hour goes by and you look up and say, what happened to the time? You're fully engaged. When you're with the sequential process, you're feeling the tick-tick of time passing. And so you're feeling every minute passing. And the way we see that operate socially is when we ask people who are sequential preferent a question like, how long is your daily commute? We get answers like 29 minutes today and 28 minutes yesterday. And we ask people who are associative preferent, how long is your daily commute? We get answers like about a half an hour, because it's about a half an hour size event. And so that profoundly impacts how you're doing your GTD practice, because if you're sequential preferent, you step into what's my next action, but you're also stepping into what evidence do I have for this? How do I know this? What's the data on this that's going to allow me to trust this? By what authority did this come to me? Did this come to me from a colleague? Did this come to me from a boss? Did this come to me from the kid at the convenience store? Is this the customer that is going to be judging this? Is this sales going to be judging this? Is this the board going to be judging this? What's the authority? And then what categories does this fit into? Is this a math problem? Is this a music problem? Is this a sales problem? Is this an operations problem? And then what resources are we going to need? What resources do we need to start? What will we need in 3 months? What will we need to complete the project? And how much time will this take? What will my next action take? What will the consequent actions take? How long will the whole thing take? And so those are the things that catch our attention, catch our energy, and light us up a little bit more when we're sequential preferent. When we're associative preferent, it's a parallel but very different set, because when we're associative preferent, our sense of time is in the present moment. When we're sequential preferent, it's in the movement over time. So when we're associative preferent, we're activated for what's my experience of this? What do I know? What do you know? What are the models of experience that we've seen that we want to emulate? Who's made mistakes that we don't want to repeat? And then we're less likely to be activated by authority and more activated by who has the know-how for what I need at this moment. So not who makes the decision, that's the authority, but who has the know-how. So that's when you don't care whether the information came from the boss or the kid at the convenience store, because sometimes the kid gives you useful information and sometimes the boss doesn't. Instead of category, you're interested in analogy. What's like this? What informs this that I know something like this? So this is when you're taking something you know in the category of math and applying it to the category of some music you're listening to. You're doing that cross-disciplinary, cross-categorical thinking to help you understand that thing in the moment. On the sequential side, we're going to need these resources in 3 months. On the associative side, you think, okay, well, we've got 3 months to find those resources or to get those resources. Let's get started. And then where we're coming to the sequential feels the tick, tick, tick of time passing. So you're feeling time as a costly resource much more powerfully. When you're associative preferent, you feel the urgency of the moment. And again, getting back to, we think this is a 21st century understanding, the tick-tick of time passing, the Greeks had the word chronos for. That's the movement of time as distance. And then kairos is the opportune moment. What is happening now in the moment that we should be open to and be aware of. So now as you're moving toward your GTD practice, depending on your preference for associative sequential, one side of this is going to catch your attention and activate your energy, and the other side is you're more likely to miss attention and lose energy for. And so things are showing up, and you're wondering, why is this easy for me to do? This thing's so easy for me to do. Why is this other thing so hard for me to do? I've identified it. I know what it is. I know how to do it. How do I move that forward? So one of the important things that we're doing now in our practice is helping people identify these two experiences of time, when they show up for them, and how they activate what they're trying to accomplish.
And Frank, while this is happening, what then, once I understand that, what would I do differently in terms of my GTD process or whatever? And Meg or Julie, you guys can talk to this probably better than me, given how many more hours you've spent than I have over the last 10 years in working with you one-on-one.
Yeah, thanks, David. Well, this has definitely been a work in progress because, in the early years of coaching, we didn't necessarily have this information. And a lot of times as a coach, we could kind of intuit our way through some of it. But we didn't necessarily have the data. We didn't have a common language with our clients of, again, the why. So for example, if I went in and one of the examples I use, if I went in and coached a group of 6 people, they were all using, let's say, Outlook email. This has nothing to do with Outlook, but they were using Outlook email. So they said, you know what, we all want to use the task section in Outlook. And I set the 6 people up in Outlook, set them up with the suggested categories. And then in the moment, they're really thinking that that's going to work for them. And then I leave, and then I do a follow-up call with them maybe, 10 days later. And why did 2 of them say that didn't work for me? Outlook tasks, and the other 4 said, love it. Why did 3 say, wow, Meg, that was way too many lists. That was like way too many for me. And the other 3 said, love it. That was the perfect amount of lists. And again, we didn't have a framework for that. And so we used to think in the early years, well, you just need to just keep working it. You need to just keep practicing your clarifying and organizing. You need to look at your list. Maybe you're not doing your weekly reviews. And I think even as a coach, I was saying, well, but this is, the first limiting criteria is where are you? So if you're at work, why would you want to see a list of things that you can only do at home? Or if you're at your computer, these are the options you want to see. But we were finding, again, it worked for some people and it didn't work for others. So one day I was coaching somebody who was getting very frustrated with the coaching. And when I started coaching him, I felt like this was a guy who was a Ferrari going down the Autobahn. His rapid integration and his processing speed was so fast. And when we were looking at emails and paper, he was getting very frustrated because I was asking him to slow down. And one of the things that happens in coaching is we have to deconstruct the systems to build it back up. And so again, I didn't have a framework about why I was slowing it down. But what was very fascinating in coaching him is he probably did have an associative preference. And what I was seeing in emails and paper was what was sequential. He would literally have to access the sequential. You don't lose any IQ points when you move from the associative to the sequential. But he needed to slow things down, really kind of, access the sequential to be able then to finish clarifying those emails as pieces of paper.
Meg, can I stop you here? Because
Sure.
This is a fascinating aha I got from Frank and you guys about dealing with ADD and ADHD and why Ritalin and all those drugs that they're giving the ADD and ADHD people actually slows them down because it speeds them up. I'm going, wait a minute. I remember back from my college days, I'd take speed to try to finish my paper on time and, do all that kind of stuff. I say, well, wait a minute. They're speeding up your brain, but they've got such a sped up brain. How does this help? And then Frank sort of gave me a big aha about that. Well, wait a minute. What it does is speed up the sequential processor. So
it allows them to stay in the sequential longer.
Right. You're willing to tolerate the time-based A plus B plus C equals D, You're willing to do that because it speeds up that part of your processor that was very slowed down when you were out there. What's the bird that's crossing my path? What's the, all that other, sequential stuff. Fascinating aha to me about all of that. So I don't know how much that helps anybody out there in terms of application, but that was a big aha to me about how and why that works in terms of how our brains are framed.
We've been integrating the focus survey work for about a decade, and we found about 80 to 85% of the people that come to us for coaching have an associative preference. Then there's a small group that have a sequential preference, and then there's even a smaller group that is actually ambidextrous. They actually have access to both the sequential and the associative. So what I find very fascinating is that, at least for coaching, what is really attractive to the Getting Things Done methodology is just that. It's giving them strategies to be able to do their work, because so much of what they're doing is staying in the associative. And when they have to access sequential, meaning what's the next action, or if they have to pick the right list manager, they don't want to fight that associative preference. And so another example that I wanted to give is, we talk about how a list manager it's not about the tool that you use, but at the same time it is. And sometimes people really get caught in what they're choosing for their list manager, particularly when they feel like being electronic is a better fit for them. And about a decade ago, I was working with a client and he wanted to use a tool that was electronic. He had a very, very high associative preference, which doesn't mean that, high associative preferences can't use electronic tools by any means. But for this particular individual, if he had to add something to his list, he had to click, call Fred. He had to open up the software. He had to write call Fred. He had to go up to the category, scroll down to find calls, save and close. And that was literally taking him out of his preference into the sequential. And that was very challenging for him. And so eventually he went paper-based, because then it was just click, open up the tab, write call Fred. And that was much more to his preference. So he wasn't fighting it. Another example is sometimes if you have too many categories, that's pulling you into the sequential if you have an associative preference. And it doesn't mean that you can't beef up that muscle and have as many lists as you need to, but sometimes in the beginning, it's better to have less lists than more. So Julie, do you want to also give some examples?
Yeah, I also think it would be great, Meg, I'm happy to do this, but I think that you kind of tee this up really well, is the tennis instruction analogy, because it's also part of the, I really love that, because, now I used to go into any client I would work with, I had my checklist. We go in and we capture everything. And then I have my little checklist of we got to do this, and then we got to do this, and we got to do this, and we got to do this. Now, we have our clients do the focus survey first, and now it's like all bets are up. Like we really customize things based on what those preferences are. And I love your tennis instructor analogy, where I'm going to have you say it because I can't.
Well, I used to teach tennis, and when, let's say that, I had Frank and David and John and Julie wanted to get better at their game of tennis, and we all got on the tennis court. They would pick up the racket, and some of them would have the racket in the right hand and some would have their racket in their left hand. And maybe one of you actually had the ambidextrous. It was very easy for you to have the racket in either or. It doesn't tell me how good you are at the game of tennis, but it tells me what your preference is, and I'm going to coach you to that preference. So if Julie's a right-handed person, which is kind of analogous to sequential, I'm not going to say, Julie, put the racket in your left hand and let's go play tennis. She could do it, but it's going to be harder for her. She's going to fatigue. She's going to get maybe a little frustrated. And then she may just quit. She may just say, forget it. This is just too hard for me, which is we get. But if I put the racket back in her right hand, it's going to be easier for her. She's going to get better at it. And if I'm teaching her to toss the ball, now granted, I haven't taught in a long time, so maybe it's changed. But if somebody's going to toss the tennis ball as a right-hand person, they're going to toss the tennis ball at about 11 o'clock. If somebody's left-handed, they're going to toss the ball a little bit differently. And so as an instructor, you don't want to have somebody who's a lefty tossing the ball as a righty and vice versa. And again, so what happens is that when we're coaching people, we have this data right off the bat. I can't see when I'm working with a client if they have an associative or sequential preference. Maybe we can make an educated guess in that way, but I'd like to have the data. And then that really informs the path of GTD mastery with that person. And probably one of the best examples I had is I was going in for a 2-day coaching with somebody, and literally in 20 minutes, he just said, forget it. I don't like this at all. I'm already tired. And he was just toast. And I just said, okay, great. We just need to do this differently and do a different strategy. And I literally brought in his chief of staff. And I had the chief of staff sit in front of the computer and start doing the sequential. And he did better kind of talking and walking and looking at the emails and doing the thinking and staying in the associative, while she also did more of the sequential, and he didn't fatigue as fast. Now, granted, not everybody has that ability here, and it doesn't mean that you can't learn and beef up that skill, but knowing what your preference is really allows you to more elegantly, as I said earlier, install and implement and integrate the getting things done methodology at every single point about capturing, clarifying, and organizing how you do your weekly review, how you actually do work, can be in a way that's literally staying in your preference. And when you need to leave your preference and go into the other preference. It's really about what your strategies are. Another example is some people do better if they're associative preference and they have to do some sequential tasks, that they put themselves in an environment where there aren't any distraction, so they can kind of layer in and do that sequential task because there's differential attention. See, that's the thing about ADD that you were saying to earlier, David, is that really people who have been diagnosed with ADD have differential attention. They have attention in one preference that can be longer than attention in another preference.
And I think also, Meg, the part about discipline, I think it's important to address. David mentioned it earlier, but so many people think that this is about discipline. If I could just sit my butt in a chair and do it, I should just be able to sit my butt in a chair. There's something wrong with me because I can't just sit here and do it. And if I just had a little more discipline, if I just had a little more willpower, I'd be able to do it. And I think now, it's very enlightening for people when we come in and we help them see, well, it's certainly there's an aspect of discipline like there is to everything, but how I do it, when I do my DTD practices more in alignment with how I'm thinking about it internally and what those preferences are, it's a lot less about discipline than it is just about the freedom that we talk about in GTD to do it my way.
Well, let me insert here. At 73 years of age, I'm cranky and direct. So I'm going to be real direct. What do you need to do to get anything off your mind? So the highly associative focused people, in order to get stuff off their mind, are going to do different things. They're going to need to make sure they've captured some of the higher level visions and bigger picture games they're involved in a trusted way so they can let it go. The more sequential people are going to, in order to get stuff off their mind, are going to make sure that they have to have a good systematic process that they trust, that are managing the now this, now this, now this, now this, now this. And here's where I am. And obviously, as you all know, we're all both of these. But given those preferences, it's not a matter of how organized do you need to be. Well, I say, you need to be as organized as you need to be to get your head clear. But for an associative person, that's going to look different than a highly sequentially oriented person, though the process is still the same. If they've still got something on their mind, they still need to make a decision. They need to clarify what it means. They need to park something somewhere that then they don't have to keep thinking about that. So I'd be curious to hear, Meg and Frank, you too, and Julie, your take on that. The principles are the same for everybody. What has their attention may be very different. How they address dealing with getting that off their mind is different. So that's what you guys are much more expertise than me.
When I love, one of the things that really shows up is this 5 steps. So how we capture, it's pretty much most of the time it's very associatively, right? It's emails just come in randomly. My thoughts come in randomly. Pieces of paper come in randomly. And then we need to move more into the sequential processor to do that clarify step. And then the organize step. And this is where, and Meg, please chime in, where people have these amazing epiphanies of, oh, right, I'm just capturing all kind of stuff. I love that. It's all random. It's great. Yay, capture. Now I got to slow down. I love this kind of, we have to slow down when we move into the sequential processor. And that's oftentimes where people get stuck. They just don't like the brain now has to slow down. So what they'll do is they'll just say, well, you know what? I'm going to do this later. I don't want to slow down now. I'll do it later. So, one of the things that Meg and I just do is, okay, how do we help our clients to do the more associative preferent clients to do the sequential stuff in a way that is easier? That this thinking is still the same. It's still required. But how do we help them do it? Do you need to do it in small sprints throughout the day versus taking a full hour? There's just so much more freedom and flexibility when we understand these things.
So an example of that would be email, right? For some reason, a lot of people think that when they're going to clarify and organize emails, it has to be sequential, that they have to look at the next one and the next one. I'm like, no, but we never said that. You can go ahead and find all those emails that are the 2-minute rules. You can find those emails that you can delete or that you can respond to quickly and stay in that associative preference if you want to. But usually what's left, as Julie was saying, is you need to be able to then move into being able to say, okay, what is this? Because there are 3 reasons why I still see emails in an inbox. One is that you don't have a trusted place to put it. you haven't finished the thinking or you haven't spent the time. And when we're coaching people, in some ways, we end up being kind of this body double for people where we're holding the world back for them to be able to slow it down. Because then once they slow it down, they kind of almost kind of hyper focus and they can just start moving through those emails. And so I think that any part of GTD, even like the weekly review, I saw people in the chat box were talking about the weekly review. Even after all these years, I still divide the weekly review up into parts because I get fatigued. And sometimes it's challenging for me to do the get clear part and get current part in one sitting. And so sometimes I'll do the get clear part the day before the weekly review, and then I'll do the get current part the day of my weekly review because I have a challenging time switching from that clarifying and organizing to reflecting time. Frank has some great strategies about what he uses when he has to, for example, access the sequential versus when he's doing things that are more in the associative. And same with Frank. And Julie, if you don't mind me sharing, has the sequential preference. And so it has to have strategies when she needs to access this the associative.
And how much time things take. That's a big thing, right? Like I love this, what Frank was saying, when someone's associative preferent, it's going to take me about an hour to do this. Versus someone who's sequential preferent will say, it's going to take me 28.5 minutes. And kind of also understanding our similarities and our differences plays a big part of this too. So I used to get very frustrated when people were late because in my sequential preference, like I understand it's going to, that should take 5 minutes. I feel like in some level it's really changed my relationship a lot with people. Now I have a lot more understanding of what's happening internally that's causing maybe someone to be late or someone to take longer for something.
Julie, let me tell a story that Frank tells about you.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. So
I'm sweating.
The cat's out of the bag. Everybody now knows that Julie has a strong sequential preference. And so when Frank talks about Julie and how she talks about time, he'll say, if you ask Julie how long it takes to get somewhere, she'll say, well, on Tuesday morning during rush hour, it takes 28 minutes. But on Saturday afternoon, it might only take 24 minutes. So she's very specific when you ask her about time and how she gives you the answer. Whereas somebody who's much more associative, like Frank, might say, well, it's about a half an hour, and that could be a range of 20 to 40 minutes, and that answer is perfectly accurate.
If you find that you come across kind of right in the middle, we call them dual processors, which means you have literally access to both the associative and sequential. I was finding that I'm actually doing it both through the associative and the sequential, where 96% of the population is basically clarifying and organizing. We're actually doing it through both. We actually have quite a few GTD coaching clients that also have that dual access. We actually have them come up with some different strategies. And so we've gotten over the last decade very good at what are the strategies with GTD for people that have an associative preference? What are the strategies for people that have a sequential preference? What are the strategies for people that have a dual processor? And again, it's not prescriptive, meaning it doesn't tell you how good you are at something. These preferences, again, like the handedness to tennis, doesn't tell me how good you are at tennis. It just tells me what your preference is. But the other thing I was going to say here about time, since this was one of the focuses of today, is when people have associative preferences, one of the things that we see as coaches is we see huge lists. Because sometimes there's a sense of that they feel like, oh, this isn't going to take me that long. And so they have these enormous lists. But then when I weigh that against their calendar, they don't have enough time in their calendar to actually get those things done off their lists in the way that they wanted to. And Frank is actually doing a lot of work with some of our clients to get a better sense of time so that when they are clarifying and organizing, they're creating projects and actions lists that are doable within the time frame, because as we all know, time is finite. We all have 24 hours in the day. As David said, you can't just all of a sudden find 25 or 26 hours. The time is finite. And that the stress doesn't come from too much to do. It comes from infinite possibilities. And so when people are sometimes struggling with GTD, it's not about the getting things done methodology that they're struggling with. It's actually about they're coming up with some limits to their cognitive preferences, that without those strategies, they're thinking that it's about the GTD systems when really it's about their cognitive preferences, which is what happened with me with Frank, as I kept on thinking it was about my GTD practice. Well, it wasn't. I needed to understand more about my cognitive preferences, and I needed to get better strategies so that I could really integrate the Getting Things Done methodology in a way that was going to work for me.
What Meg was talking about, the way we're digging down with people, is that we've learned that there are 3 cognitive positions that we hold in order to understand time. There's our projection of time in the future, so what we imagine we're going to do. Then there's the experience of time in the moment, and then there's our reflection about it afterwards. And so we do a 3-step process of making people aware. If you, say, have a friction point, there's a period of the day or something you're trying to accomplish that you're just not accomplishing. So we identify a time and a place you're going to do that thing. And then the day before, we have you anticipate it. Really put your future self into that. What's going to happen? What's going to show up? How are you going to feel? What's your energy going to be like? How are you going to prepare to be in a place where you need to be to do that thing? And then we have you record what actually happens at that time. And since life is unpredictable, well, most of life is predictable, but it shows up at random times, so we call predictable randomness. Random things will show up, and you may do or not do what you plan to do, and that may be okay or not okay. But then you reflect back on it afterwards. And we're finding people, your whole life shows up when you start to look at those 3, look at something not as a single thing in a moment, but how you think about it beforehand, how you engage it in the moment, and how you reflect on it afterwards.
Frank, you're driving down the road. Your associate says, that's a bird that crosses the thing. There's a red light. They've got an accident over there. I have to slow down, etc. But I also need to get my oil changed. I think that's what you're talking about, is those 2 different kinds of things that people are engaged in. So, a lot of this talk is about how do I understand those 2 different things and give room for both of them and actually optimize both of those. So that I don't lose the value of, wow, there's a bird over there, there's an accident over there, so tomorrow I'm going to go a different way. Your associative brain is kind of figuring that out and seeing all those connections and seeing whatever. But at the same time, you go, wait a minute, this car needs an oil change, and I need to make sure that gets into the system. So I would assume that you would say, well, what GTD does is allow you to park it from an associative standpoint, allows you to park commitments or potential commitments you make in that frame of mind somewhere, so that right. When you have the ability to then stop down and say, okay, I now need to be sequential about this so that my life doesn't fall apart, that's much more easily handled, right?
Right, and then one of the actually brilliant strategies you gave me, because as you know, I swim and I bicycle, so it's not easy when those thoughts come in about the oil change to capture those. So you taught me in those moments when it's inconvenient to, in the middle of laps, and I'm not going to be able to capture something, but I had a great idea. You taught me to envision myself walking in my office, sitting down at my desk. And so when I'm in the middle of that lap, I have an idea that I want to capture, I imagine myself walking back into my office, sitting down at my desk and thinking that thought. And it'll go out of my head. I'll be completely oblivious. I'll go home. I'll walk in the room, sit down at my desk, and the thought comes back, because my past self planted it into that future place. And I've taught that to other of our clients, and many people have told me, David, that that's an amazing strategy.
Well, the funny thing is, Frank, of course, if you capture ideas when they first happen and don't have to keep recapturing them and rethinking them, you'd be surprised how few ideas you actually have.
That's true too.
It's actually not that big a task, but you got it.
Okay, panelists, are you ready to field some questions that we've captured so far?
Please.
All right. So I've got a few of these, and any one of these you might be able to spend an hour or two talking about. So we'll get through as many as we can, and let's give these a try. So first one, can our preference change over time?
Frank?
Oh, yeah. Very good question. As you know, we actually have a version of the survey for pre-readers that lets children look at pictures and say which one's more like you. And then we have an elementary version, high school preparation for and college version, and then the professional version, the focus survey, which you take. And we've actually been looking at this longitudinally now over 24 years. And one of the things we see is weak trends in families, and statistically we call it a weak trend because it's better than random but not strong enough to be predictable. So we see preferences show up kinda in families, and then we see enormous possibility for neuroplasticity from birth until about age 25, because our brains continue, most of us get our full height somewhere in our late teens, but our brains continue to grow in volume till our mid-20s. So we see a lot of neuroplasticity, a lot of possibility of change. We rarely see somebody move all the way from sequential to associative or associative to sequential. We see movement from the center to make your either associative or sequential stronger, or movement back toward the center to make it weaker. But we rarely see somebody start out sequential and end up associative, for example. But we see lots of movement up until age 25. And then after our brains start going in growing volume, it gets pretty durable. It's hard to move. We've seen it happen rarely, but it's rare enough to be anecdotal.
Okay, thanks for that. Next up, I typically get stuck with clarifying and identifying next actions. Do I need to access my sequential process more when I'm clarifying and identifying next actions?
Coaches?
I think, Frank, can you answer that one a little bit more, though, first?
Yeah, when you try, our sequential process activates when we're in that metaphorical examination room needing to solve a math problem. Now, you probably walked into that room with your associative dialed up, so you could be aware of all of those fascinating people in the room, the architecture and design of the space, what was going on outside the window, and what you're going to have for lunch that day. All of that present awareness stuff is the domain of the associative. And then to do that math problem, you have to put the full weight of your attention and focus on that one thing, screen out or ignore all of that stuff that's going on around you. So when you move from, okay, I've identified everything that's got my attention, I've aligned it into my projects and priorities, that's all the associative, now I've got to do that one thing. And so that's when you shift yourself over into that associative process. And that's when you need to slow yourself down, hold yourself still, screen out as much as possible, or close extra windows on the computer, silence the phones and messages and pop-ups, put a sign up that says back at 2:45 or whatever it is, so that people don't interrupt you. So you create that defended space to do that one thing. And that's that next action. That's that, what category does this fit into? What resources am I going to need? How much time is this going to take? And you've got to create a defended space to do that.
Yeah, and then let me just add the organization piece. Over the years, I just have found that for a lot of people in our profession, you end up having a project list and a someday maybe list and an agendas and a waiting for list. But the call anywhere, calls, computer, office, and home and errands, those 6 lists, I think are really still up for grabs. Even though the limiting criteria is where you are, if for some of you, you might really benefit from just having a next actions list, just one next actions list. You still have your projects, someday maybe, agendas and waiting fors, but have that next actions list and then organically build it up if you need to have some other lists by context, like maybe a calls and a next actions list. Because I think that then you'll get a kind of a rhythm so that when you're clarifying, you're also elegantly organizing in a way that's going to be a better fit for you. So even though we give you those suggested 10 lists, sometimes I think less is more in the beginning. and naturally build that out for yourself.
I've got a couple of them left here before we get to our stop time in about 5 minutes. Here's an interesting one. Is it possible to force the brain into the sequential or associative process so you can use it like a superpower at will?
Yeah, and moving from one to the other is actually not all that complicated. We get stuck because we're not aware of the difference. The difference is invisible. So in that case, then we're controlled by it. And one of the classic ways we see that is you're driving down a highway and you've got that wide situational awareness dialed up for everything that's going on around you. And then all of a sudden there are blue or red lights on the other side of the road. Your attention gets drawn to that, and now your sequential takes over to try to unpack what is going on over there. And then you can move from the divergent focus of your attention holding open across the wide range, focus it down to try to figure out what's going on over the side of the road, and then you drive into the bumper of the car in front of you because you've lost that divergent awareness. So we're all moving back and forth between the two, much the same way we walk left, right down the street and carry things with both hands, but we're not conscious of it. The way we activate one side or the other is with the question. And that's why David's work, again, struck me as so powerful. Because David, he doesn't tell you, well, pay attention to your next action. He says, what's your next action? Our brains respond to questions differently than we do to information. So if we ask ourselves sequential questions, our brain will move into the sequential process. If we ask us an associative question, which David asked, what's your attention? It moves your brain into that associative process. So if you want to consciously use them, consciously ask yourself associative and sequential questions, moving yourself in one direction to the other.
Not only that, whatever you're weakest in, when you get conscious about it and use it consciously, you'll be better than people who do it naturally.
Right.
So it's fascinating about that. I've seen that about personality traits or whatever. If you're not a highly sociable person, when you actually are sociable, you make tons of mileage out of just saying, thank you so much. I really care about you. People who say that every day don't make that kind of impression. People who that's a tough thing for them to say, once they do it and it's real, man, they get such power out of that. So associative people, when they become sequential, are incredibly fascinating and powerful in that regard, and vice versa.
Yeah, thank you. It's learning. It's a right-handed professional soccer player trains to be fluent on both sides.
Well, Frank, when I learned karate, we were trained, bilaterally. I had to be able to punch equally with my left and my right. It turns out my left snap punch is much more powerful than my right because I'm right-handed. Because my left got to transcend all the conditioning of my right-handedness. And so it actually became much more powerful. So it's a fascinating thing when you start to see these dynamics that you don't block yourself or box yourself in, called I'm limited in this. Called, well, that's just a naturally weaker side of my game that once I get control of it, I may manage that much more powerfully than other people do.
Yeah, and that's in the 20th century, we had the meshing hypothesis. So you took a personality inventory, and this is what you were, so this is what you should do. And that was really broken. That notion was broken by research in the 90s. So now that we know you really do want to exercise both sides, and again, that was the breakthrough of GTD. It didn't just say, okay, you're this way, do it this way, you're this way, do it that way. It opened it up. It opened up both sides.
I think that's a great place for us to bring this to a close. I was looking for a point to step in here. That seems like an ideal point to say thanks to all of you panelists, thanks to everybody who was joining us on the webinar. I've got all kinds of notes I've taken to send as a follow-up email to all of you. So that'll include information about the focus survey, the research references that Frank was pointing out to you, PDFs and other things. So Meg, Julie, Frank, David, thank you so much for hanging out with us and talking and spending some time with us.
Have a wonderful rest of the day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay.
Ciao.
All right. Bye, all.